So, you might have seen this image at some point in time on the internet. It's usually referenced in religious imagery, perhaps something to do with the occult, and occasionally in film or media if they need something that looks foreign and mystical. So, a lot of people have seen it and perhaps will recognize some of the terminologies associated with it, but what exactly is this thing? Where does it come from? What does it represent? And most importantly, what does it mean? So, let's get into an explanation of the 10 Sefirot. Oh, and before I begin, please consider liking this video or subscribing. It really helps out my channel and promotes my content. So, first things first. This image is the concept of the 10 Sefirot, a very complicated and esoteric notion derived from Jewish Kabbalah and Chassidus. Where does it come from? Well, it's very commonly referenced in a lot of classical works of Jewish mysticism or Kabbalah, Chassidus, and similar texts like the Tanya, the Zohar, and otherwise. But really, its oldest source is probably that of a book by the name of Sefer Yetzirah, one of the oldest texts in basically all of Judaism and pretty much ever. Nobody really knows who wrote it for sure, but many attribute it to the forefather, Avraham, or perhaps even earlier, to the first person ever, Adam. But what's actually going on with this diagram? What does it represent? Essentially, this diagram represents attributes, 10 of them, of God. This relates to some other more Kabbalistic notions, such as the tzimtzum, literally contraction, which is essentially the concept that due to God's sheer infiniteness, he had to conceal himself through a series of stages to allow room for the existence of a finite creation. But that's a bit of a disjointed topic from here, so for now let's just cover these 10 Sefirot. It is important to note that these 10 attributes are not God himself, but are essentially a description of the different ways God expresses himself into the world. This is particularly seen in the word Sephirah, which is derived from the Hebrew word lesaper, to communicate or to express. So, that's broadly speaking what this represents. 10 different ways of God expressing himself in the world. You'll notice some are on the right side, some on the left, some in the middle with branching lines intersecting between all of them. Plus, they're in Hebrew, and although each one literally translates to a certain word, the individual words refer to concepts far more complex than just their terminologies themselves. So, let's break it down. Firstly, they're separated into two different sections. The intellectual capabilities being these first three, Chachma, wisdom, Bina, understanding, and Da'as, knowledge, and then the emotional attributes being the bottom half, Chesed, kindness, Gevura, restraint, Tiferes, unity, Netzach, victory, Hod, splendor, Yesod, foundation, and lastly, Malchus, kingship. So, what do any of these even mean? As mentioned, each is referred to by a certain word, but each is representative of a far more lengthy and complex concept, which we'll go through one by one. So, the first one, at the very top right, is the notion of Chachma, wisdom. This refers to the concept of an initial spark of wisdom or of an idea prior to being given any finite definition in words and understanding. Rather, this notion refers to the deep fundamental knowledge within the first flash of intellect. This is also seen in the Hebrew word chachma, which, if broken apart, is koyach ma, literally the power or potential of what. So, it basically represents not an idea itself, but that first initial spark of an idea which comes into your head before it's fully defined with form and words. The second of the Sefirot, over to the left, is that of Bina, understanding. This is the idea of actually understanding a concept in a tangible manner. It is the realization of what first sparked into being by Chachma, now given actual form and definition in a concept that could be properly understood. So that's what Bina is. Afterwards goes Da'as. This is essentially the unity of these two concepts and refers to grasping a concept in actuality as opposed to abstraction to such an extent that it can be felt, hence why it's the linkage between the intellectual attributes and the emotional ones. Which then brings us to Chesed, kindness. This one is fairly simple. It's the idea of giving and benevolence, as seen by the figure who exemplifies this attribute, Avraham, who was all about giving and kindness. The opposite of this attribute and its counter is Gevura, restraint, also literally strength. It's the inverse of giving. It is to limit and contract, and is exemplified by the patriarch Yitzchak. Both of these two, chesed and gevura, benevolence and restraint, are equally necessary. I mean, a car needs both a gas pedal and a brake, and this applies with the world. You need reward and you need punishment. Neither could exist by itself. Which is why you need the next one, Tiferes, unity, which is the combination of these two. Again, as neither could exist on its own. You need both together to run a functional world. That's why it's also referred to as compassion or mercy, and is exemplified by the patriarch Yaakov. Netzach, victory, is, again, an extension of the previous chesed, and denotes total domination, as opposed to Hod, which comes from the word Hoda'a, which means to thank or to submit. And then there's the combination of the two, Yesod, foundation. The very last one, Malchus, is representative of essentially communication to others. Being the last, it doesn't really represent anything itself. However, it is the concept of how God reveals himself or communicates, in a sense, with the world. Also, above all of these is Keser, literally crown, which is representative of the divine will. So, that's essentially that. However, this isn't just by God, because there's another fundamental point, which is that you actually have two souls, your Nefesh HaBahamis, your animal soul, and your Nefesh HaElikis, your godly soul, which is essentially a piece of God in the most literal sense. So, you'd also have these 10 attributes reflected in yourself also, and they have practical relevancy, of course. Chesed could represent love of God, while Gevura would be fear of God. Netzach would be the desire to prevail over doing the wrong thing, and Chachma is representative and emblematic of selflessness. There's also a thing about them being represented by certain body parts. I don't really know what's going on there, really. If somebody wants to explain that, please, great. But yeah, this whole thing is pretty complicated and esoteric. It does have some relevancy in some of the more complicated areas, but yeah, that's the gist of the thing, if you are curious. Hopefully that clears that up. If you've ever wondered, definitely do more of your own research. This is just a very broad overview. So that's enough for now. Hope you enjoyed, and with that said, have a great night.